to our webinar tonight. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Anushka. I'm from the MAKE program at Griffith University, and I'm going to be facilitating tonight's discussion. I believe we have admitted everybody in from the waiting room. I have popped some self-care information into the chat. Please post your questions into the chat, but we'll go in a little bit further into some of the webinar ground rules as we go forward. So before we get into it, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are all meeting on tonight, wherever we may be. I sit here on the land of on Bundjalung country, the land of the Yugambeh people and the Kumbamerri saltwater people. I acknowledge their deep spiritual connection to this land, the sea, and their millennia-old culture. And I acknowledge that I have benefited from living on stolen lands and that sovereignty was never ceded. I recognise all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander faces or people onto this webinar tonight, and thank you all for joining us. Given that this is a webinar that we are bringing to you as part of the 16 Days of Activism against gendered violence, I'd also like to acknowledge all victims and survivors of violence against women in our culture. Recognise that we are doing this work for you, and we will all of us here who are presenting tonight will continue to do this work in your name until we eliminate violence against women. And I acknowledge your strength and your courage, and thank you for being here also. Family, domestic and sexual violence is a major health and welfare issue. In fact, I would label it a national crisis, a long-standing pandemic affecting 1 in 3 women globally and claiming the life of at least 1 woman a week per year, consistently year after year in Australia. It occurs across all ages and all socioeconomic and demographic groups, but predominantly affects women and children. There are some groups of women at higher risk, including women with a disability, First Nations women, pregnant women, women experiencing separating from their partners, and women experiencing financial hardship. Violence can be perpetrated by a current or former partner, an informal carer, a child, young person within the family unit, or a relative. You will hear us using gender binary language tonight. So we talk in terms of man and woman. However, we recognise that there are more than just men and women, and that domestic and family violence occurs in all relationships, including same-sex, transgender, and gender diverse relationships. We gender this conversation because international evidence tells us that the drivers of domestic and family violence and the underlying dynamics are gendered. And if we address these drivers, we'll go a long way to addressing violence within any intimate relationship. Importantly, domestic and family violence is 100% preventable, and we all have an important role to play in creating safe, equal homes free from violence. So let's get into it. Some things to remember. The content discussed during this webinar may be confronting and may cause distress. Please disconnect from the conversation should you feel like you need to, and please contact 1800-RESPECT, which is Australia's 24/7 confidential counselling hotline, or any of the numbers we've posted in the chat function there. Also, we will revisit those numbers again at the end of the session. Moving forward, please stay muted unless you're asking questions, and keep the camera off to limit distractions. Avoid distractions scrolling through the webinar. We'd love to keep you focused and recognise that this is 1 hour, important hour of your time, and an opportunity to learn how we can all make a difference. So stay with us. Save up the questions for question time at the end, and if you're asking a question relating to someone or anyone you know and how you can provide support to them, please don't disclose anything that might identify them. Be mindful of others in how you communicate in the chat. Please be kind, and remember that this webinar will be recorded. So if you don't want your name to be visible in that recording, please pop out and maybe adjust your name in the way that it is visible on the screen. Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce you now to our expert panel. Sian Ross-Smith is currently the director of the MAKE Bystander program at Griffith University. With a career spanning almost 20 years in the criminal justice sector, Sian has a vast experience in working with perpetrators of serious and violent crimes, victims and their families, and the agencies who oversee domestic violence in Queensland. Sian is also the chair of DV Connect, Queensland's 24/7 phone line for women experiencing domestic violence. DV Connect also has a sexual assault and a men's line. Sian chooses to work along the continuum of domestic violence in both the response phase and the prevention space. So that ensures that she's well informed in her advocacy, her facilitation, and her leadership in this space. Sian, I want to ask you a question to kick off. Why is this topic important to you?
Hi, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I know that 6 o'clock on the night that certainly for me, my kids go on Christmas holidays is a difficult time, but I really appreciate everyone joining us. Why is this topic important to me? Because as a human being, I cannot bear to think that there are women inside their communities, relationships, homes and spaces that feel unsafe at the hands of the man who's supposed to love them. I feel like it's my responsibility as a woman of privilege who enjoys a safe and equal relationship to advocate for and do all I can to eliminate violence against women. But it's actually on all of us, I think, too. So I cannot think of a more important role than looking out for and advocating for women, because women are pretty incredible and we do some pretty incredible things. And so that's why I'm here.
Thanks, Sian. Now I'd like to introduce Vanessa Fowler. Following the death of her sister, who was murdered at the hands of her husband in April 2012, Vanessa and her parents turned their anger and sadness into something positive by starting a conversation around family and domestic violence. Vanessa is on a journey to empower and educate the community around the signs of domestic violence and teach tactics to become an active and effective bystander. As an educator, it's important for Vanessa to address the underlying attitudes and cultural beliefs that perpetuate gender inequality and the socialisation that leads to violence against women and children. Vanessa, going to you. Why is the bystander approach in particular so important to you and your family?
I feel that we are passionate about the bystander effect because we, as Allison's family and her friends, were the bystanders in her situation. And looking back, if we'd have known then what we know now after all of the information that we've received since sitting through her 6-week trial, we really would have done better. We could have done better and we should have done better, but we didn't know what we didn't know at the time. And I think that in order for Allison's legacy to be a positive one, we really need to reach out to the community, and my parents and I feel that it's important that we're able to share our experience so that others feel empowered to step in and certainly perhaps change someone's life or save someone's life. And for us, it's all about paying it forward and making sure that people are aware and they have the skills and the tools necessary to be an effective bystander.
Thanks, Vanessa, and I absolutely know that the work you are doing is saving and is prompting conversations that will change lives. So thank you so much for what you do and what you have brought to this space. And finally, Kellyanne Tansley, welcome. Kellyanne is the Service Manager for Brisbane Domestic Violence Service, an activity of Micah Projects. BDVS has 5 programs supporting survivors of domestic and family violence and their children. BDVS also provides group intervention to men who use violence within their relationships. Kellyanne has over 11 years experience working in Queensland in both child protection and specialist domestic and family violence, not-for-profit organisations. Originally from the UK, Kellyanne studied honours in psychology at Cambridge and worked for several UK government agencies in supporting vulnerable and at-risk people. Kellyanne is a strong advocate for women and children's safety and equality, with expertise in evidence-based frameworks of practice and risk management. And Kellyanne raises the voices of the women supported at BDVS in advocacy at local and government levels around system reform and best practice models. Kellyanne, why is this topic important to you?
Thank you, Anushka. And before I start off, I just want to say it's an absolute privilege to be here tonight with Vanessa and Sian and share our work and our experiences in hopefully raising awareness within community and professional and private settings around domestic and family violence. And I hope throughout this webinar we can provide some practical tactics and intervention strategies for those of you attending with us this evening. So why is this topic so important to me as the service leader of BDVS? It's important to me because it's really important to women. At any given time at BDVS, we can be supporting up to 400-500 victims, survivors of domestic and family violence. And we sit in a really privileged position where we hear the intimate details of their experiences of abuse and their stories. Often within those stories, women share with us the reason they came to connect with our service and times where they've been supported by family members, friends, colleagues at work, or other professionals. For some women, these experiences are incredibly positive. They've made a disclosure, or somebody within the community or within their family has identified behaviours that are a little bit concerning, a little bit alarming, and they've created an opportunity for the woman to share her experience, which often then leads to her reaching out for professional support from services such as my own. In other situations, the experience isn't as positive for women. Some women share with us that they've reached out for support and made a disclosure, and they felt like they haven't been heard, that they weren't believed, that the behaviours of the perpetrator were minimised. In some instances excused. You know, they've heard things such as, well, maybe he's had a bad day at work, or maybe you're under some financial pressures, or, you know, the kids have been really naughty recently, maybe that's why he's treating you and behaving the way he is. And this can be quite problematic to women because it takes a lot of courage for them to reach out and make a disclosure or seek support. And if at those times they feel unheard or not believed, it can validate the abuse which is being perpetrated on them and prevent them from reaching out for professional support. So for us here at BDVS, we're really committed to raising awareness within community and reaching out to colleagues within the workplace and professionals within professional settings to describe what domestic and family violence is, the impact it has on victims, survivors and children, and hopefully support bystanders in understanding how they can support safely disclosures victims to seek professional services such as our own.
Thanks, Kellyanne. You're absolutely right that bystanders play such an important role in validating the experience of the person who's experiencing violence and showing that support from that very first disclosure, or actually placing themselves there as somebody who is able to receive a disclosure in a safe and respectful way as well. Vanessa, if I can go to you now, thank you for sharing your lived experience with us and with the world for the sake of education. In the years after losing Allison, you've had a steep learning curve about domestic and family violence, and I have been part of that journey with you, and I can absolutely attest to how steep that learning curve has been for all of us. What would you say is important for family and friends to recognise as domestic violence?
Well, I think the most important thing is that domestic violence is not just physical. I know that as a family, we knew very little about domestic violence and thought that it wouldn't happen to us. That doesn't happen to us. That happens to other people. And we were looking for physical signs, but after our journey together with you and Sian, our family has certainly come to the realization that domestic violence manifests itself in so many different ways. And I'd like to implore people out there who are listening to please look for those non-physical signs, emotional abuse, financial abuse, technological abuse, because those are very, very important, and those are often not so obvious to recognize. And in our situation, there was no physical signs in Allison's case. So that was very hard for us to see. It was very hard for us to justify what was going on behind closed doors. And in the end, it was only through her diary and her journal that was a part of evidence at the trial. And also in hindsight, just picking up on some of the things that we saw that went on and we knew was going on, we have realized since her death that they were aspects of domestic violence, and she was suffering in silence, and we as a family didn't know that. So we will live with that guilt for a very long time.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks for sharing. I think one of the really important factors that we talk about in the training that we facilitate that uses Allison's experience, thanks to your family, is that Allison didn't know what she was experiencing either, right? It was, and that your gut feeling, your instinct as a family were telling you that something wasn't quite right. You just didn't have the language to be able to have that conversation or to ask questions or to prompt discussion.
Yes, I think it's very important that people do trust their intuition. In our case, I knew my sister and we knew her as a daughter, and the things that she was going through were really out of character. Her behavior was out of character, and we knew that there was something not quite right. But of course, as I said, we weren't aware that it was domestic violence. And so we thought that she was strong enough and determined enough to make her marriage work, and she would come through it in the end. But unfortunately, he had the power and control over her and ultimately took her life.
Thank you, Vanessa. Sian, over to you. How do you best describe domestic violence? How would you describe it to someone? And given you've directed the MATE program for a number of years now, what are the key messages you deliver in training to community members regarding recognising domestic and family violence?
Thanks, Noosh. I just wanted to go back to something that Vanessa just said, because Vanessa, we actually delivered Allison's gift today to a major organisation, and I begged and pleaded that they would do away with every single manual and policy and procedure they had, and just put a sign up saying go with your gut. Because I really feel like we're at this point now in 2020 where everything is so governed, and we feel like there must be a manual, a script, or something here that tells us how to do this. But in actual fact, it's your gut, isn't it? And that's what you're saying, that your gut was telling you, but we've been so conditioned not to go with that. So I just love that little bit that you added there, Vanessa. I define domestic violence as unequal power and control. I feel like that's the easiest way to distinguish it from what it isn't. I think sometimes we get caught up in, when I ask people to describe domestic violence, they can often describe characteristics of unequal power and control. So things that a perpetrator may use to gain power and control may be emotional abuse, isolation, financial abuse. That's the tools of the trade, I guess. But the reasoning behind that is to gain or maintain power and control. And actually they do that with this element of fear that flows throughout it. So that element that if I don't do what he's asking, or I don't do what he's threatening, or I don't fulfill this, that what are the consequences? What could happen for me? And that could be through a look, an action, a gesture. So yeah, I always say to people, Noosh, that that's the best way to describe it. So why am I here, and what's the MATE program? So the MATE Bystander program is essentially a personal leadership program, and it empowers everyone really to step into their personal leadership, because we're all leaders, right? About finding ways to speak up and say something when we hear something that isn't okay. But it's more than that. It's also a program that helps bystanders better understand what they might be seeing or hearing, and how to safely navigate those conversations. Mate also talks about what lies beneath the pointy end of violence. So how do we find ourselves living in a culture or a society or a world, particularly in Australia, where one woman a week or over one woman a week is being murdered at the hands of her partner? We're here because of the culture around us that supports violence. So things like sexist jokes and language and all of those things that disempower women. So actually violence against women occurs at every level of society, individually, in the family, in our community, in society and globally. So we want to, at MATE, we want to dismantle that, and we want to ensure that women are afforded the same opportunities as men. Well, not the same, but the equal opportunities as men. And finally, I just wish that I'd known this stuff, that I had received MATE at the front end of my career when I was starting out, because I realised now that I actually I worked in the criminal justice system for a long time, and I actually made women more unsafe. And I did that by not knowing how I was contributing to the problem, just not knowing what I was doing that was contributing, either through my inaction, through my apathy, or even contributing to violent supportive attitudes, laughing along at jokes and things like that. So MATE's, I guess, an all-inclusive program that talks to what it is, why it's not okay, and how we can all address it and prevent it. Yeah, so I love it. I just, you know, I know that I sound like I'm selling Tupperware when I talk about this program, but I remember I went to a session 5 years ago before I joined this team, and my predecessor, Dr. Shannon Spriggs-Murdoch, was facilitating it. And I sat there with my mouth wide open, just going, how did I not know this? How have I come this far and I didn't know this stuff? How did I make assumptions or decisions on behalf of women, of victims of domestic violence, without asking them, without understanding their journey and what was happening for them? And I really want to make sure that I can take this message to everyone out there, so that we can eliminate this. This is 100% preventable. So that's it, and that's MATE, and that's what we do. I guess just really quickly, Nush, MATE goes all across Australia. We travel all across Australia. We've got lots of different consultants, some of them on the line tonight, and we deliver our message to universities, to prisons, to government organisations, anyone that will have us. We have conversations about this stuff, because if we don't, who's going to? If we don't do this, who's going to? This is really important conversation to be had, and it's up to me to have these conversations. So I'll continue to do this work until we've eliminated it. And then I'll let everyone in on a secret here, and that is that once we've eliminated violence against women, I absolutely commit to taking over a Bunnings and working at Bunnings and just working in the outdoor, you know, furniture section for a couple of nights a week. Because the reality is this is 100% preventable, and it just makes me so devastated to think that there were 3 women in the last 48 hours murdered at the hands of their partner or former partner in our country, and it didn't make the news. I didn't see it on any of the local news stations. I haven't heard about it much in the media. To me, if that was 3 people murdered in any other way, we would be hearing about it non-stop. In fact, some of the shows on TV may have stopped in their tracks in order for that to be breaking news. That is not okay for me. Thanks, Nosh.
Agreed. We should all be outraged. And thank you. Thank you for the work that you do in this space and the incredible advocate that you are. Kellyanne, Sean talked about power and control and power and control being the underlying dynamic of domestic violence. And we know that Brisbane Domestic Violence Service has been advocating for the criminalisation of coercive control. Why do you think this is important for increasing the community's understanding of domestic and family violence, and how will it address domestic and family violence in the long term?
Look, I think a lot of the points both Vanessa and Sean have both touched on, hopefully I can tie into my response of this answer. You know, it really saddens me to hear Vanessa's guilt around not identifying Allison's experience, but I hear what you're saying, Anushka, when you remind Vanessa that Allison also wasn't aware of what was occurring to her. This is not a unique situation. We support thousands of women each year at BDVS, and within my career, I've had the privilege of talking directly to hundreds of women about their experience, many of whom come to us and they have, as Sian mentioned, this gut feeling, you know, something's not right. There hasn't been a physical act of violence, so they don't identify that they're in a domestic and family violence situation. They feel uncomfortable. They know that some of the behaviours that are being perpetrated on them by their partner are not okay. They feel that their sense of self is corroded. They often have loss of identity. You know, the person they were before is quite different to the person who they are now. But they've often been subjected to a patterned form of abuse over a prolonged period of time, which is quite secretive and covert, and gradually increases as the duration of the relationship goes on. So because of that, and because of the subtle nature of it, and often people around them not identifying or picking up that the behaviours that their partner is using is abusive, and then themselves, they stay within the relationship and with it continuing going with their own internal struggles of a corrosion of sense of self and identity. And this is a very familiar story we hear from many women that connect with our service. So that's why we think it's incredibly important to raise awareness around coercive control and talk to people about what these behaviours look like. So the community, professionals, colleagues, friends and family members, victims, survivors can identify these behaviours and the patterned nature as red flags, and then hopefully reach out to seek support. I want to share with you, I kind of want to unpack some of the behaviours of coercive control, but share with you a little bit of context as well. So as a specialist domestic and family violence service, we've always understood coercive control as power and control. So it was in 1984, the incredible Ellen Pants and her team at the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, America, developed what we all often, many of us professionals in the sector, know now as the power and control wheel. Now, I'm just going to share my screen with you all so you can all have a look at this tool, because when we're working with women, for them often it's when they see this tool, you know, they have an epiphany because they identify with many of the behaviours within the segments. So as you can see there on the tool, it's a circle with various different segments outlining categories of abuse. And underneath the categories is descriptions of behaviours. Now, 85 to 90% of these behaviours that are within this wheel are what we now call coercive control behaviours. And at the centre of the wheel is power and control. Because as we understand domestic and family violence, it's a patterned form of abuse to assert power and control over the victim. Worldwide, this is the most referenced tool in the domestic and family violence sector for professionals, and what we're really happy to see is in more recent years, other professionals and healthcare settings, GPs and practitioners are using this tool to understand domestic and family violence. What this tool reminds us is that it's a misconception that domestic violence is just only physical abuse. We still are responding to DV as a system, as a society, as incidents. And coercion and control allows us to understand that it's a patterned nature over a period of time with intent to instill fear, to manipulate, the victim, to degrade the victim, to isolate the victim from social supports and networks. This is why coercive control is really important to us as a service. In many countries around the world, this is illegal, or they're considering making coercive control illegal. And anyone can experience it. But as you mentioned at the start, Anushka, statistics tell us at an international level and at a national level, and within our own service here in Brisbane, that this is a gendered issue, and it's often grounded in gender-based privilege. Here at BDVS, 80% of the women that connect with our service describe to us behaviours that have been perpetrated towards them that are coercive and controlling by nature. Furthermore, there was just a recent review in New South Wales that looked at homicides over a period of time. And what they found within that review is that 99% of the cases, the relationships were characterised by coercion and control. Now, what I'd really like to kind of describe to you all today is what these behaviours look like, because that's what we're all here today. That's what we're here on this webinar to learn more, to pick up the red flags, understand this subtle nature of abuse. So hopefully we can intervene, offer support, and create opportunities for disclosures from victims. It's really important to remember that the behaviours I'm now about to describe don't happen in isolation. They're often systematic and happen together in a patterned form, and often over a period of time. So one of the main forms of coercion and control we see and women share with us here at BDVS is isolation. Now, this can happen in many forms, but a lot of women tell us what it looks like is the perpetrator insisting that they share social media accounts, that he has access to her mobile phone, that cutting off ties with family and friends. And this can happen in a couple of different ways, fabricating lies about the victim to family and friends, or making up stories that, you know, family and friends dislike the victim, so then she cuts off ties and becomes isolated. One of the other tactics we see and hear from women is the monitoring of the woman's activities, and this can be in insisting that she informs the perpetrator of her whereabouts when she's out in the community, or keeps communication open with him around what she's doing at work, who she's with, who she's had contact with. In some cases where we're seeing high levels of power and control, this looks like overt surveillance, cameras in the home, cameras sometimes in the bedroom, GPS tracking devices in mobile phones, and in children's toys and children's devices as well. Another behaviour used in relationships that have coercion and control, where the perpetrator is perpetrating this form of abuse, is denying the victim of freedom. And this can look different for each woman, but often some of the themes we see is restricting her access to education, to the workforce, to social networks, restricting access of transportation, and once again, stalking and surveillance with devices and phones. Women often share with us one of the forms of coercion and control that has a significant psychological impact is name calling and put downs. So this is often quite malicious, the abuser will be using frequent criticisms and bullying types of behaviour, which often corrodes the woman's sense of self, confidence and identity. This with the other forms of isolation, limiting finances, so insisting on shared bank accounts, not allowing the woman to have credit cards within her own right, putting restrictions, so strict budget restrictions is something women share with us a lot here at BDVS, and then her having to explain where money's been spent, what she's bought in shopping, is often something they share with us. Women, when they connect with our service, are often in need of financial assistance in the form of food vouchers, transport vouchers, because they've been limited from access to finances, or they don't have bank accounts in their own names, or they've been restricted from accessing employment opportunities. Another behaviour or tactic of coercive control we see quite frequently here at BDVS is the reinforcement of traditional gender roles. Now, this isn't always even in heterosexual relationships. We see this also in same-sex relationships. And this is where the perpetrator or the abuser is insistent that the victim is the primary caregiver of the children, that has to take care of all the cleaning duties within the household and the cooking, and often puts with that an expectation or a standard in which the perpetrator feels that the victim needs to achieve to keep him happy and please him, and if this standard hasn't been achieved of, you know, keeping the house tidy and clean, or the quality of the food, or the way in which the children are being raised, often then we see other tactics being used, so the isolation, threats, name calling, belittling, and various other strategies. Within coercive control, it's always important to talk about reproduction coercion. We work with a lot of women here at BDVS that have had multiple pregnancies in short succession from each other, forced pregnancies. We work with women who are restricted access to contraception, women who are forced to take contraception when that's not what they feel comfortable with. Some women who are restricted access to clinics to support them with terminations, with unwanted pregnancies as well. Reproduction coercion is something we see quite frequently within our service, and often for women, this has a huge impact on other areas of their lives. So women who we support who've been forced into multiple pregnancies and births are then more vulnerable with limited access to the workforce or education or social opportunities, because of course they've spent a lot of the time child rearing and pregnant as well. Jealous accusations. A lot of women talk to us about jealousy at BDVS and talk to us at social gatherings or within the workforce, or within, you know, even friends and families in social groups there, that if they're seen to be engaging or talking to somebody of the opposite sex, then the perpetrator becomes highly jealous and controlling and making threats towards them. This often leads women into retreating from social situations without confidence or fear in trying to make new connections, and also in the workforce, which then really kind of reinforces that isolation for her and leaves her feeling that she's very limited in her ability to be able to make other connections and reach out. one of the behaviours that women share with us quite frequently when they're in relationships that are characterised by coercion and control is threats that perpetrators make towards their children or towards their pets. Often this is then a barrier for them feeling confident to exit the relationship through fear of the repercussions on the safety of the children, or that the perpetrator will try to remove the children, take the children back, use the system to try and gain access and control of the children, or with pets. If they're looking to come into safe accommodation, into shelters, and these shelters or safe accommodation options can't support them with their pets, there's fear there that the perpetrator will harm the pet should they leave the family home. And often this fear is to that level with the mix of the isolation, the financial abuse, the threats, the derogatory language, the put downs, the lack of connection to social supports and systems, friends and family, prevent women from having the confidence or feeling safe enough to take the step to remove themselves from the relationship. So I just wanted to really unpack some of these behaviours with you all here today, because in isolation, as single incidents or single events, all of us, could quite easily ignore them or brush them off, attribute it to, the perpetrator having a bad day, the family being under stress and pressure. But when we really take a step back and understand this as a form of abuse with intent to instill fear, control, manipulate, isolate the victim, we can start to understand how complex it is and what a significant impact it has to the emotional well-being of victims and survivors, and to their ability to be able to seek support and exit these relationships. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kellyanne. It's all going through that power and control wheel, unpacking what coercive control is so important for bystanders. It's so important for, all of the research around bystander intervention means that it shows that we have to actually understand that what we're seeing is an issue. And for us to be able to do that and understand those non-physical signs of violence, we need to really be able to see what coercive control actually looks like, what it sounds like, and what we might be seeing or hearing or sensing as a bystander. So thank you for that in-depth explanation. Vanessa, what advice would you give to people about around having a conversation about domestic and family violence with their loved ones or their friends?
I think that the first piece of advice I'd give to them is to actually go ahead and have the conversation, because the main barrier I think a lot of people come up against is fear. They fear that if they say something, there's going to be consequences for the victim, or if there's children involved. And I know that in our situation, that was the case. We felt that if we pushed that little bit harder to find out exactly what was going on in the marriage, that there would be consequences for Allison and the 3 children, and that may be physical abuse involved. I think that it's important that people overcome that fear and gain the courage and confidence to step in and to actually have that conversation, because if you're not going to have that conversation, who is? And it's really important that if you've noticed something, then the situation is probably already pretty bad. It's probably it's worse than what you have initially thought. But my recommendation would be to decide to have the conversation, gain that courage to have the conversation, but importantly, along the way, you need to also change your mindset. I think that a lot of us are conditioned to think, well, we have to mind our own business and we can't interfere in anybody else's marriage or relationship. They are going to work it out themselves, and we just have to let them work through the issues. But I really think that we all need to be busybodies, and we need to step in and actually have the conversation. That's the most important thing that I can stress to people.
Thanks, Vanessa. Sian, I want to throw it over to you. I'm wondering if you can address for our participants tonight that fear of making it worse from your perspective, and some of the things that you could say, or some of the most effective questions you could ask as an effective bystander if you're feeling that fear.
Yeah, great question, Nush. And how amazing are these participants? The questions that are coming through, I'm like, can we please just have 3 days with these incredible people who want to do something? And this is the thing, everyone wants to do something. We just need those tools. What I want to say is that if your intent is good, if you're coming from a place of really reaching out and wanting to do the right thing, you can't get it wrong, right? So that's a really important number one thing to know. If you're reaching, you think about a time where someone's reached out to you, and that, you know, you might be going through something and something's, you know, been happening for you. They weren't someone that had all the answers. They weren't someone that came and said, right, Sian, I've got a 12-step manual. We're going to sit down and work through this systematically. If you're someone that wants to go give me support, just show up with some food and say, hey, Sian, you know, you're looking a bit stressed. Here I am. And actually, Anushka's done that for me so many times this year, because I've had a really challenging year, and she's just shown up with some food and said, I'm here. The beautiful parts about that is Anushka didn't come to me with any judgment. She didn't come to me with expectations of what I should and shouldn't do. And her support didn't have an expiry date. But often, I want to take that away from me for a moment and talk about domestic violence. There were some questions there about what people could do or say. Oftentimes we think that we have to ask the question, which is, are you experiencing domestic violence? And yet that's very rarely the question a bystander would ask. More often than not, that beautiful line of, are you okay? Are you okay? You know, you seem a bit, you know, quiet today, Sian. Is everything okay for you? Or I guess I think, if you think about what works for you, I like when someone's been a bit vulnerable with me. So I don't know about you, Sian, but I've just had a really challenging year. How's your year been going? You know, I know when I was trying to navigate homeschooling, it was difficult. And what that does is just allow that person to kind of go, okay, we're not kind of keeping up appearances here. I can speak a bit more of my truth. But I guess if I want to take you back to that wheel that Kellyanne so beautifully articulated a moment ago, and I want to say to you, print out that wheel and have a think about it. If someone is going through something and you're a bystander, a loved one, think about, as a bystander, what you might see. So if that person's experiencing financial abuse, you might see that perhaps they're not coming to the lunches that you're having, or they're not, you know, doing certain things, and just being able to say, you know, how are you going this year with finances? I'm really struggling, or I'm finding it's really quite a challenge. Or how do you work it out in your home? Because, you know, I'm trying to do up this budget and I don't really know how to do it. So opening up with bits about yourself always helps for other people to open up about their stuff. Don't forget that people might actually say, oh no, I'm cool, everything's okay here. But nothing lost, right, from doing that. So I say, if you've shown up with the best of intentions, you absolutely can't get it wrong. And we could talk about that for a long time. I'd love for anyone here, if you feel like reaching out to any of us at the end of this, to please do so. Nush, you had a question here for me about engaging men. Do you want me to talk to that?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'll try and keep it really brief because there's so many important people talking about some really cool stuff. Some strategies for engaging men around domestic and family violence. No one is engaging men. No one is holding the men who use violence accountable and having vital conversations or doing the work. There are very few men, and those men are incredible in this space. We absolutely need them, but we need more of them. We continue to place an emphasis on women to seek help, to move out of their home, to go to court. We put the emphasis on women, supporting women, and there's all these probably the majority of women are in this chat tonight, right? And we're saying, what can we do? We actually need men to speak up. But when I talk to men about what's holding them back, they often give me a couple of really good tidbits of advice. The first one is, tell me that I'm not going to make it worse for women if I say something to him. Tell me I'm not going to make it worse. So I say to them, things are already worse. She needs you and me and all of us to say, hey, that's not a cool thing you just said about Hannah. Or let's go for lunch somewhere and chill out. Let's go for a camping trip or a drive or whatever it might be, and actually ask questions like, are you okay? What's going on for you? I've had a rough year. Tell me about yours. I'd love to hear how you manage stuff at home. I'm really struggling. Or just opening up with some conversations that we want men to have, but we haven't equipped them with those tools of how to do that, because we've often told, we've often given these rigid gender stereotypes that tell boys to just be quiet and do the stuff. So we've got to make sure that for the next generation, we're inviting boys and young men to be comfortable having these conversations. Men will say, help me understand that what I'm saying is not going to make him go off at me. And I say, you don't need to ask, are you using violence in your home? You don't need to address it directly. You could use something that feels safe and comfortable. So asking, are you okay? I've noticed that you seem really withdrawn, sad or down, and I've been feeling that way too. How can I help you? Those are really amazing bystander tools that we should be using with men who use violence. And what if I don't always get my language right and I'm pulling up a mate, but I'm not perfect? No one's perfect. Anushka and I actually pull each other up every single day on the language that we use. So either one of us might say something in a sentence, and then the other one will say, can we actually say that anymore? Is that contributing to a culture of violence? And then we might Google it, or we'll do our research and come back and say, no, we actually can't say that anymore. Let's not say it. So but getting used and familiar with doing that, and neither Anushka and I take offense. It's actually a really great learning opportunity. And you know what? This is one that I know there's going to be people on this call that go, come on, Sian, but remind men of the women in their life and what they want for them. We're not there yet where we can say that everyone should just respect women. I'm a huge fan of meeting them where they're at. And if we have to talk about the women in their world, let's do that and walk alongside them. So what's important for them? What do they want for the women in their life? And we go from there. What type of relationship would they like to see those women in? How can they then contribute to a world that makes sure that every man will treat every woman like that? And even if we start there, look, I've got daughters now, or I've got a mother and a sister and an aunt. So I'm all about women. So I'm in this space because that's why. If that's the motivator, that's absolutely beautiful as far as I'm concerned. We need to absolutely harness and do what we can with that. So I guess that's a really long-winded way to answer your question, Nush. Sorry.
No, thank you. That was beautiful. I'm going to do a little bit of improv because I can see that we are quickly running out of time. The chat has been really interactive. We have a question there from Lucy, or a statement there from Lucy that I briefly addressed. But Kellyanne, I want you, if you can, please, to talk to the participants about image management. What that means as people using abuse, and what the impact is of the person who is experiencing their abuse.
Thank you, Anushka, and Lucy, and everybody who's been in the chat. Absolutely, thank you for having the courage to share experiences, and also being engaged and asking questions, because this is what this is about, right? It's a conversation. We don't have all the solutions to solve domestic and family violence yet, but we're all working hard within our sector and creating opportunities to have conversations like this and engage victims and challenge perpetrators in safe and appropriate ways. As Sian was just mentioning, it is definitely the right step forwards. But in talking about image management, I think this is a critical part of understanding domestic and family violence. We have to remember this is intimate partner violence. Victims love their perpetrators. They were in an intimate partner relationship. often, or too often, but thankfully not as frequently nowadays as I used to hear, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, the comments of, why doesn't she leave? Why doesn't she stay? And hopefully when I was talking about coercive control, we can understand how difficult it is for a victim to leave. But often she loves him because he's not always this person. And that's really important for us to remember. There's sometimes a bit of a myth around, you know, we call it the monster myth of perpetrators, that these are going to be guys that are easily identified, you know, when we're walking down the street, when we're at social gatherings, within the workplace, within the sports precinct, you know, we'll know the perpetrator. Actually, no, you won't. He's most likely to be incredibly charismatic, come across as a doting father, a beloved husband, the head of the family who works tirelessly to bring in the income, you know, for the wife, for the children, to be the protector, to be the provider. And there I'm describing a lot of the issues which underpin gendered violence here within our community. I'm talking about toxic masculinity. We don't have the time to go into that today. But, you know, these are kind of the images men put forwards. We see this as well, particularly when we're in situations of high risk and police are called out to incidences where victims have been harmed. Men use strategies, the, you know, image management strategies, cool, calm, collective. But it's really important that we have to remember that the tactics of power and control are quite subtle and always at play within these relationships. But what we would call, you know, higher incidents of explosion phases are often less frequent. So the woman is hopeful that things are always going to get better. And often the perpetrator does a really good job at displaying this image within the home and within community, that, you know, he's a great fella and he would never engage in these types of behaviours.
Thanks so much. Vanessa or Sian, anything to add to that? Or any final comments?
Everything Kellyanne said is exactly what I would say. And I notice in the chat there's a lot of conversation about that. He will absolutely present as you actually see it play out in the media. So, you know, the interviews with friends of his that will say he's a great guy, he's such a great dad, and so that to me tells me that, yeah, he was able to keep up that facade. Please know that we in this space, in the domestic violence sector, we all understand those nuances. We see you, we hear you, we believe you, and we are doing everything we can to support you. But we absolutely see that, we know that. And that's the education that we get out there as well, so that you know that is the information that we're giving. Please know that we are trying to provide that voice for you when we talk to people, as Kelly and just did then, as Vanessa did when she speaks, and Anushka and myself. Vanessa?
Oh, I think my final comment would be to ensure that you show the victim that as a bystander you believe them, you don't judge them, and you're there to support them. So I think that it's really important that as part of being an effective bystander, the support that you show is authentic, and that you need to make sure that you are there when your support is needed. But the most important thing is believe and don't judge.
I think they're pretty good words to end on there, Vanessa. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kellyanne. Your insights tonight and what you have been able to share from your professional experience has been invaluable. And I hope that people are taking away some key takeaways from particularly the power and control wheel. Vanessa, I tell you this all the time, but please let me tell you again that what you are doing is changing and saving lives. And thank you for your vulnerability and your courage in assisting us to do that and to change this and eliminate violence against women for everyone and change our culture so that we can prevent it long term. And Sian, thank you so much for your leadership and your advocacy in this space. Your honest and authentic approach to being an effective bystander is so accessible for everyone. So thank you so much. Thank you all for attending our webinar this evening. If you need further support, I will leave the numbers here on the screen. And reach out to any of us anytime through BDVS, the Allison Baden-Clay Foundation, or MATE. And we are all on social media. Follow along with us. All of us are sharing some great resources about bystander behaviour. So please check in with us and please follow along and remain connected, because if we want to eliminate domestic and family violence, it's going to take all of us, and together we absolutely can and we will change the world. So thank you so much.